Presidential Library's History Uncovered. From the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan, exploring the life and career of our 38th president.
Well, was it a good evening?
Well, I got to bed about 1:30 and got up about 5:45, so it was a short evening.
What are your feelings this morning as you prepare for this eventful day?
I think a feeling of sadness on the one hand and expectation to start to build on the other. It does strike me as a terribly heavy responsibility, which we're going to try and work on and do our very best.
The President talked last night of the heavy responsibilities that were going to be on your shoulders today. Do you feel those?
You can't help but feel that way.
Mr. Vice President, when Harry Truman had the office suddenly thrust upon him, he said that they felt like the stars and the moon and the planets had all fallen on him. How do you feel getting the same responsibility dumped on you?
I think that's a very apt description, and I can tell you better after noon today when it actually happens.
Just hours after that press conference outside their home in Alexandria, Virginia, Gerald and Betty Ford walked across the south lawn of the White House with President and Mrs. Nixon to a waiting Marine One helicopter. And shortly after that historic walk, in the wake of the Watergate scandal, Gerald R. Ford was sworn in as our nation's 38th president. And what you're looking at right now is President Ford's White House daily diary for that same day, August 9th, 1974. It's at the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we'll be throughout the night tonight as our presidential history series continues with a special focus on our nation's 38th president, Gerald R. Ford. And as always, if you've been watching our series, we begin with our consulting historian for the Presidential Library series, Richard Norton Smith, who is with us here in Washington, D.C. Well, for many of our viewers, this is not really history. This is just yesterday.
That's true.
But set the stage.
Tumultuous chapter of yesterday.
Yeah, set the stage. I mean, here it was a 25-year congressman from Michigan thrust into the White House by the Watergate scandal.
Yeah, the most unlikely of presidents, raised by the most tragic of circumstances. Gerald Ford had never aspired to the presidency. His great ambition was to be Speaker of the House. And he realized that wasn't going to happen, so he had already promised Mrs. Ford that he would leave office after '76 and they would go back to Grand Rapids. Well, needless to say, events conspired to rewrite the script for their lives. He is nominated by Richard Nixon to be vice president in replacing Spiro Agnew less than a year before this date. And he becomes president on August 9, 1974, has to deal with the consequences of Watergate, with Vietnam, with a looming economic recession, with an energy crisis. And on the other hand, he did get the bicentennial in 1976. And then, of course, the historic race with Ronald Reagan in 1976, and then Jimmy Carter. And you know, it's only 2.5 years, 895 days, but very eventful.
And here we are talking less than 10 months from his death this year, when the nation had a chance to revisit or to learn firsthand about much of his history through the events in his burial. Now, we should tell people in sort of full disclosure here.
Sure.
We've told them all along that you've been very involved with the startup of a number of presidential libraries. You were the first director of the Gerald R. Ford Library.
No, actually, I came to the Ford Library in 1996.
But along the way, you developed a personal friendship.
Yeah, actually, I was very fortunate to develop a close friendship with really the whole Ford family. And he was very, very active and very supportive in what we did, and I'm very pleased to say that continued after I left Grand Rapids. And
presidential historians who in the audience here, the folks watching at home that study so much of this on a personal basis, might even remember that you were asked to eulogize the president in his funeral.
That's right. Actually, he asked me to do sort of cleanup duty. I was the last speaker at the very end, and asked to sort of sum things up maybe from a historical as well as a personal standpoint.
So perhaps this evening we'll get even better stories than we have all along the way throughout the series. For those of you who have been watching us throughout this 12-part series, each of the 12 presidential libraries, you know that our goal is to use some of the fantastic collections at these individual libraries, not to tell you the whole history of the presidency, but to add some additional perspectives by showing you rarely seen audio and video clips to help put together some of the pieces of the broad strokes of history that we know about the President. Tonight we're going to focus on 2 sets of video interviews. Will you tell our audience about them?
Well, that's true. Well, we're going to use, first of all, the James Cannon taped interviews. James Cannon is a distinguished journalist, a former Newsweek bureau chief in D.C., who went to work for then Governor Nelson Rockefeller and came with Rockefeller to the Ford White House, ran the domestic counsel for President Ford, and subsequently became his biographer, and is working on the 2nd volume of his biography. And in the course of researching that, Jim did very extensive, and I think the audience will agree after listening to them, very candid conversations with President Ford.
And we're going to see one of those right now.
Actually, I think we've got a couple that are lined up. One is, in fact, on how Gerald Ford first learned about Watergate, and with some pointed comments about then Attorney General John Mitchell. And then right after that, I believe, his recollections of the meeting with President Nixon in the Oval Office in which he learned that Nixon intended to resign.
And although the book is out, this is the first time that this video has been seen on television. Let's take a look at one of these Cannon interviews.
When you were sworn in as VP, was there any sense in your part that you might have to be president?
I had no expectation. I had no forewarning. I had been assured, as I told you earlier, by John Mitchell, that neither he nor the President knew anything about it. I had been assured by Nixon that this was really all the Watergate activity was purely Democrat partisan politics. There was nothing to the break-in. He was not familiar with it, had nothing to do with it. I must say, to my best knowledge, I never said, Mr. President, did you know about the Watergate break-in? I can't honestly say I asked him that question. In retrospect, I probably should have.
Well,
I was asked to come over to the White House to talk with Nixon. I went in to see Nixon, and he asked me to sit down, just the 2 of us, nobody else. He said, Jerry, I am resigning. You will become president. It wasn't a long conversation, maybe 20, at the most 30 minutes. We shook hands. He told me that he was going to submit his resignation to Kissinger, which I guess is the policy under the Constitution. He would take off, and it would be, transition would take place at noon, when he was about flying over St. Louis, Missouri. There was no gushing, there was no, dramatic embrace. It was too sad a situation. It was just a recognition on the part of both of us that time had come and his choice had been made and my fate had been decided. He looked very sober and grave, but he was such a proud person. He would not show distress or a collapse. His face was very drawn. I mean, he talked about where he thought the world was and where it was going. That's how he got into the Kissinger thing. He was very, very upbeat on Henry. Reassured me that Henry was a bit of an eccentric. He didn't let Henry take all the credit for
that's right.
all the things,
all the great,
all the good things. But that was understandable. And he did most of the talking. We reminisced a little about our families and our long friendship.
which had gone back to 1949. It was an experience I hope no other president or vice president have to go through.
Those audio recordings with President Ford were done by biographer James Cannon in 1990, and now you're looking at some television footage of some video of Gerald R. Ford as president.
That's Bill Coleman, Secretary of Transportation, first African-American cabinet member in a Republican White House.
And we get a look at the Ford Oval Office there.
Yeah.
How much changing of the room did he do?
Mrs. Ford actually redecorated the place. She left a real imprint on it. The night that they went back, of course, to the White House, as you know, because the Nixons, although the Nixons left, the Fords didn't move into the White House for some time after, because it took several days to pack up all the Nixon belongings. And a classic Ford story, that night Mrs. Ford was slaving over a pan of lasagna, and she said, "Jerry, there's something wrong with this picture. I'm still cooking, and you're President of the United States."
We'll talk a little bit more about Mrs. Ford in the program. Let me show you, as this nation was getting used to a new man in the White House after this very tumultuous time. Here is a depiction of him by an editorial cartoonist. That is on location at Ann Arbor, Michigan at the Ford Presidential Library. And let me introduce you to Elaine Didier, who is the director of the Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum, and she will be our expert on location throughout this first hour tonight. What should we know about that depiction, Dr. Didier, and what it meant to the ordinary American?
Well, that depiction is a wonderful illustration of the perception of Americans of Gerald Ford after the trauma of Watergate and the denial and the deception. This was a man who not only was perceived as a Boy Scout and to beat that, an Eagle Scout, but also who was one in his values. And so this was a very favorable one of, we have hundreds of political cartoons in our collections, but this was one that indicated the mood of the country and the shift in tone at that time.
And he was, in fact, an Eagle Scout, and you have an artifact there to show us to that effect.
Absolutely. Gerald Ford is the only one of our presidents to have earned the rank of Eagle Scout. He did so at age 14 in 1927. He'd been in scouting for just 3 years and had qualified at that time. And one of the things that's very precious to us about this item is that Ford was so proud of the attributes, the things that he learned from being involved in scouting. So to us, it's a very precious object in our collection. In fact, I was reading a story that he told in a speech recently, or he gave in '74, that he took a pledge, he vowed to himself on the day of his court of honor that he would never do anything to besmirch what this Eagle Medal meant to him. And so he lived those values and was very proud and was very involved in scouting through his life.
Well, the library has had quite a year with being the host site for the presidential funeral at the beginning of the year, and you've had, I understand, many, many more visitors with the uptick in history of the Ford presidency, and you're also getting lots more materials. Tell us what the year's been like for you and your staff.
Well, it's been a very busy year, to put it mildly. I think that the way one of my colleagues said it, we anticipated and planned very carefully for the funeral activities, and our team pulled together magnificently from my perspective. But to be honest, we didn't really anticipate the influx of materials we would receive, both from the Ford family and from individuals who are now turning to their closets and sending things, and we're very grateful for all of that to fill out our collection. We have had about a 70% uptick in reference inquiries, both audiovisual and textual, and we're just incredibly busy, and yes, the visitors are up, and we're glad for that. We had many, many people during the time of the funeral, about 110,000 in that 7-day period, and then now afterward we've had another 120,000 visitors. So we're delighted to have people coming, and we hope more of our citizens will come as well.
Well, you and your staff, as have all of the folks at the Presidential Library, has been very, very helpful in helping us put this series together, and we thank you for that. Before we go any farther, why don't you tell us about the room you're standing in?
Well, the room I'm in is President Ford's office here in the library, and it's one of 2 offices in our facilities. There's also an office that he used when he was at the museum in Grand Rapids. Neither of these was a working office in the sense, say, that Harry Truman's was, because his home was in California rather than 6 blocks away where he could use this as his home base. So his post-presidential working office was in Rancho Mirage.
We also have to explain to people when we say presidential library and museum, in the case of Gerald Ford, we're talking about 2 distinct facilities. Explain all that for people.
Yes, we are. We're unique in the system in having 2 facilities 130 miles apart. President Ford had begun leaving his congressional papers to the University of Michigan Historical Collections back in the early 60s, and of course had not expected to become either vice president or president. So when he did become president, the University of Michigan was very interested in having those papers as well. And Ford, of course, was very loyal to his alma mater. And meanwhile, his hometown of Grand Rapids wanted to have a museum to honor him. And so we have a typical Ford bipartisan, keep everybody happy on both sides of the state decision. And we have 2 wonderful facilities, but they're just not on the same site.
Richard Norton-Smith, let's go back to some of the video that we want to show people tonight. This next video piece, our first video of the evening of the 2 sets of interviews, is by David Hume Kennerly.
Yeah.
Now, that's a name that might be familiar to people from the Ford years. Who was he? Who is he?
Yeah, well, he's very much with us. David Kennerly is a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer who first met Gerald Ford in October of 1973. He had been asked to stake out several would-be nominees for the vice presidency. He went up to see Congressman Ford, who said, "You're wasting your time." Kennerly said, that's fine. At least you'll get a decent photo out of it. And they struck up a friendship and became very close. He really almost became, I mean, he really is a member of the family. And as you will see, there's an extraordinary intimacy that developed and that allows Kennerly to be the proverbial fly on the wall throughout the Ford presidency.
How welcome were the Ford family members to being followed by the press and by photographers in particular?
Astonishingly, because they had some real reservations about going to the White House, what it would be like. But it turned out once they got there, they were very open, for the most part, very relaxed. But Kennerly is a special case, there's no doubt about it. And these are interviews that he did. He did an extensive series of videotaped interviews with President Ford in 1995.
What use? Why was he doing the interviews?
My hunch is he may very well have been thinking about doing a book like the book that he's just done and is about to be published, as a matter of fact. It's a great big book of photos, most of them never before seen, illustrating the Ford presidency.
You're getting a first look at it tonight. Mr. Kennerly allowed us to get an advance copy of this so we could show you the end product of his photographs and interviews here. Let's roll on our first Kennerly clip here with Gerald Ford talking about his life as a commuter president in the early days.
First few weeks you were commuting, you were leaving your Crown View Drive and going to commuting to the White House. How did that work for you and the family? I mean, what?
Because President Nixon and his wife had to leave so suddenly on his resignation, it took some time for the transition from their moving out to the Ford family moving in. So my wife and I, with our son Steve and daughter Susan, stayed at our home in Alexandria, Virginia for 7 or 8 days. So the White House residence actually was in our very modest home out in Alexandria, Virginia for about a week. Actually, we stayed there until we went to Chicago for a somewhat memorable speech that I made before the one of the veterans organizations, and after that speech Betty and I came back and actually moved into the White House.
This is a shot of you and Jack with some boxes at Crown View. And do you think you were the first commuter president?
Well, certainly the first commuter president in this century. We had built and lived in this house for about 18 years, which was our family residence for most of the years that our children grew up.
Unless you count Harry Truman walking across while the renovation was
going on. Well, that's true,
on.
absolutely. The speech, by the way, in Chicago was to the VFW, and that's the speech where he unveiled his Vietnam amnesty program. And he knew it wasn't going to be well received. He said, at least I won't have to worry about applause. Applause is for applause.
Elaine Didier, you have some reflections and observations about the Ford presidency and its relationship with photographers.
Yes, it was a very different relationship. Ford did two things when he went to the White House, among others. He turned off the tape machines and had everything removed of that nature from the Oval Office. And secondly, he hired a team of 5 photographers. David Kennerly was the lead among them. They had phenomenal access, and David in particular had phenomenal access, not just to what that was called in the Nixon administration of meet and greets or grab and grin, the 1 or 2 minute photo opportunity, but they were involved in meetings. They received high-level security clearances, and they were very, very much everywhere. And this is just one of about 130 books of contact sheets that we have in our collection. And just think about of your family photos. We're dealing with more than 300,000 photos and about 280,000 from the White House period alone. What we have on the music stand here is illustrative of the access that David Kennerly and others had to him. The top frames here are of President Ford fixing himself breakfast in the kitchen in the White House, in the residential quarters. And the very fact that he permitted those shots to be made of him was just illustrative. We have many, many photos of the family in the personal quarters, at Camp David, on airplanes, many, many kinds of access points that were not permitted in the prior administration. So he was notable. He really wanted to communicate with the American public, and the photographers were a big way that he did that.
And also with those, Richard Norton Smith, those photographs of fixing breakfast, it was a symbolism to the nation that there was a regular guy at the helm.
Oh, yeah, everything. I mean, it seemed like overnight. And he actually understood. He understood how important symbolism was at that point. Remember, they stopped playing Hail to the Chief. They replaced it with the University of Michigan fight song. They stopped referring to the White House as the mansion. It became the residence. The first week he was in office, he invited the Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, and others.
Was this gut instinct, or was he being advised?
No, I think it was gut instinct. I think he understood. You know, the very first person he had to reassure was his own wife. Walking in from the helicopter that day to the White House, before he was sworn in, he leaned over and he whispered in her ear, "We can do it." Because I don't think she was happy about what was going on. She wasn't happy about where she was going. She wasn't sure where she was going. None of the family was. And he knew that if he couldn't reassure his family, he certainly couldn't reassure the country.
1 month into it, he made what was sure to be the most momentous decision of his political career. Why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, defining one. Well, Richard Nixon may have been gone from Washington, but he most definitely was not forgotten. He haunted this city like Banquo's ghost. And on August 28th, Ford had his first press conference. And to his amazement, and frankly, I think he can be faulted for being a little naive, all the press really wanted to talk about was Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon's papers and his tapes and his chances of avoiding legal action and the possibility of a pardon and everything else. And anyway, Ford discusses in this tape, very candid, with his biographer Jim Cannon, what followed.
And you're seeing that the video right now, the announcement on September 8th, 1974, that Gerald Ford was pardoning Richard Nixon. Let's listen to him talking about it many years later.
Or taken part in during the period from July 20.
He could never allege that I backed off in times of crisis. And I happen to think I did him, along with the country, a great favor at a tremendous political expense to me.
That's correct.
When I pardoned him.
You did.
The truth is, to my knowledge, he has never forthrightly thanked them.
Should he?
It never hurts to thank anybody.
Right.
After that press conference where I was besieged with questions on the subject, as I walked back from the White House to the Oval Office, that set me off and made me explore the possibility how I could get rid of that issue so I could concentrate on the more important things that involve 230 million Americans. Because I could visualize every press conference from then on, regardless of the ground rules, degenerating into a Q&A on the, was I going to pardon Mr. Nixon? It would come after he was indicted, which he was going to be, after he was convicted, which he was going to be, after his appeal. It was a never-ending process. When I went back to the Oval Office, I said to Phil Buchan, Phil, what right do I have to pardon Nixon, period? And after I got confirmation from Phil that I could, I exposed the idea to about 4 people, maybe 5. Kissinger, who I must say thought it was a good idea, but was a little apprehension. I have, in my own mind, said, God damn it, I'm not going to put up with this. It's wrong for the country in every way, and the only way to get out of it is to do what I did. My name was the only one that went on the piece of paper.
That's right. You had the only vote.
That's right. And I can say without hesitation or qualification, I have never regretted. You know, there were allegations that it was a deal.
Right.
So there were 2, Peter Rodino of the House Committee on Judiciary, an old dear friend of mine, said, we have to have a hearing, Jerry. I said, fine. Let me go up there. It's fine with me. Thank God I did.
Exactly.
If I had hidden behind the facade of being president and not going up to testify, that controversy would have gone on and on and on. But I had absolutely nothing to hide, and I was anxious to go up there and prove it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. We meet here today to review the facts and the circumstances that were the basis for my pardon of former President.
And there you see the President, former man of the House, going back to Capitol Hill to testify about his pardon of Richard Nixon before the House Judiciary Committee. Richard Norton Smith, the significance of all that.
The only time in American history that an American president has testified before a committee of Congress.
And what about separation of powers? How did they get comfortable with all of that?
I don't think anyone was comfortable with almost anything at that point. I think there was a lot of improvisation going on. This story illustrates that as well as anything. But he was perfectly comfortable with the idea of going back to speak to his old colleagues on both sides of the aisle.
And was that, in fact, because he'd known them so well and for so long, he really did feel comfortable?
He did feel comfortable, and quite frankly, on both sides of the aisle, even people who disagreed with him thought he was a man of integrity. And so when he said there was no deal, if nothing else, they were inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt.
And in 2001, the Kennedy Library awarded him a Profile and Courage Award, and what you're seeing right now is the president accepting that from Caroline Kennedy. Back out at the Ford Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Elaine Didier has that Profile and Courage Award. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you know of the president's reaction in getting it?
Yes, this is another one of the treasures of this collection. This, along with his Eagle Scout pin, were very cherished honors, as President Ford expressed personally. This one to him represented a vindication that 27 years before he had made the correct decision, and it was especially meaningful coming from both Ted and Carolyn Kennedy. Senator Kennedy had been quite critical, as many were, of the decision about the pardon. So for Ford, this was a wonderful feeling, and we're honored to have this in our collection as a gift from President Ford several years ago. And we also have copies of handwritten letters he wrote to Caroline and to Ted Kennedy in advance of the event, but saying how honored he was and how much this award meant from them. So I think for him it was a very special occasion.
After the pardon, the White House continued to pace, and our next bit of videotape is from a network interview, Harry Reasoner, going to Camp David.
Yeah, and there is one intervening event that should be mentioned in passing, because you'll see Mrs. Ford here. And in between the pardon, 18 days after the pardon, came her operation for breast cancer, which was a thunderclap, and which I think overnight transformed the way women in particular viewed a disease that up until then had been kept in the closet. So anyway, I think this is about the first time that she's seen in public. But yes, the President invited Harry Reasoner of ABC and the American people for a tour, and I don't believe it's been done since. I know it wasn't done before that.
We've all heard so much about Camp David. Let's see what it looks like.
"60 miles away from Washington, 1,800 feet higher, 15 degrees cooler, is the nearest thing the U.S. government has to a presidential dacha, an official country retreat. Franklin Roosevelt invented it and called it Shangri-La. Every president since has used it, although Harry Truman didn't like it. Gerald Ford decided the country ought to have a look at the elaborate retreat it provides for its first family. We drove up with cameras recently as the last of the leaves were falling." Mr. President, tell me a little bit about this place. How big is it?
Well, they tell me it's roughly 200 acres, Harry. Was land that was acquired some years ago, developed primarily, or initially, I should say, by President Roosevelt, but expanded in facilities and much more used by President Eisenhower, and that's where it got the name Camp David, named after his grandson. And
they each have a name. That's cedar, that's
rosebud. You can see they're all in the same style of architecture, which fits in really beautifully with the trees and the whole setup that's built here.
It seems to me that you are unique, certainly in our lifetime, in the way you got to the presidency, and in the fact that obviously you weren't scratching and climbing to get there most of your life. When you come into that, you get all the problems, the well-known, awesome responsibility, but you also get things like Camp David. Is it kind of fun sometimes?
Harry, it might be very hard to believe, but I really enjoy it. The things like this, of course, are awfully nice. I must say it's nice living in the White House. But the challenge of the problems, I also enjoy. It's great to have the opportunity to make some decisions. Hopefully I trust they're good, but as Harry Truman once said, the buck stops here. It's my understanding that when World War II came along and they started using it, and again after President Eisenhower took over, they decided this was a very appropriate place. It was handy to Washington for the purpose of transportation, that it could be used as sort of an altered emergency White House. And the net result is it's really
you can run the country from here.
You actually can. There are some very appropriate security measures, but also communications. Hi, dear.
Hi, dear. How are you?
You know Harry Reasoner, and
how are you? Nice to see you. Who's your friend?
Liberty.
Hey, Liberty. Who are you?
Yes.
This must be paradise for a dog.
It's our first visit here.
Just took off after the dog. Well, the dog was faster than she was.
She never saw a deer before, I suppose.
Well, I was wondering what her reaction would be.
How do you like it up here, Mrs. Ford?
Oh, beautiful. Just love it.
Just
really do.
It's a nice place to get up here and unwind, right? I got 8 hours sleep last night, which is the first time in a couple of weeks, and it's hard to get up even after 8.
Good imagine. Now, the presidential families live in what, in Aspen?
Aspen, right, and we'll walk down there. It's, as I understand it, it was the original lodge. It's been expanded, but it overlooks the valley there. It's a beautiful view.
You got the swimming pool then.
Very handy.
Place to make your own English muffins, or have you given that up even?
Well,
that's a good joke.
I used to, but not anymore. I like that first hour, Harry. And I think Betty likes that extra hour of sleep.
Well, I found out that he enjoys the newspaper more than anything else.
First thing in the morning.
Are you going to bring Liberty down here with us? Or?
Shall we go up and look at Sam Lane?
Okay.
Fine.
Bye, Betty.
How many people, if you were going to have an international conference or a domestic summit, how many people could you conveniently?
Oh, there are ample quarters for a good many people. There's a fine conference center. I think there are roughly 40, well, there's availability for about 40 people to stay here. And of course, they can come and go very easily, either by helicopter or driving. It's only a couple of hours from Washington.
Well, this is your place.
Well, this is where presidents stay. It's the nicest place on the Camp David site. It's a place where you can really live as a family, Harry.
Is it big enough to bring all your kids there, or I suppose they could use another cottage?
I think the children would prefer to live off by themselves, but there are enough bedrooms so that you could have at least 2 other, well, actually 4, because they're twin beds and 2 bedrooms.
Sir, you talked about enjoying the challenge of the presidency. How about your kids? They had some mixed feelings.
Well, they had, it was an abrupt change, Harry, and I think they've adjusted well. I think they're proud of the fact that their old man is in the White House, but it hasn't changed their lives materially, and they've adjusted, as I said, to the fact that Secret Service are with them. 2 of them are in school out of town. Susan is living with us, and Steve's out on a ranch, and that's what they wanted to do, and we're doing. We hope to get together with them in Vail, Colorado at Christmas time in a typical Ford family Christmas period, which we've always done for the last 10 or 15 years.
President Kennedy said, I think, to Mrs. Kennedy after he got to like this place and they were building another house, he said, why build a weekend house when we've got this for free? Is that essentially what you think?
I think that's my reaction. It's a total complex, and it's so comfortable, and it's so beautiful, and it's so handy with all the facilities that you need as president. I really don't think we ought to go beyond it.
We do want to point out that there are many other sights to see at Camp David, which we were not permitted to film for security reasons. Such things as the inside of the President's Lodge, his swimming pool, his 3-hole golf course, and his view of the mountain valley, which he told us was strikingly beautiful. We did take our cameras into Birch Cottage for a sit-down talk with the President. Birch was the lodge used by President Nixon as his office. I'd like to just tick off some of the chief criticisms of you, President Ford, including some from people who respond to you warmly. I suppose the basic one is that your administration so far seems rudderless, without direction. The feeling that you do not have the grip on it. The second major criticism is somewhat allied to that, which is that you are a nice guy from Michigan, that people respond to your warmth and your friendliness, but that you haven't got the magnitude of the grasp on the presidency. Can you grow into this job, sir?
Well, I honestly believe, Harry, that I grew into it in the 25 years I served in the Congress. When I came from Michigan in 1949, I concede I was provincial, except I'd have probably more educational breadth, having gone to the University of Michigan and Yale Law School, which was a great experience for me. But when I came to Congress, after serving 4 years in the Navy, where I traveled pretty extensively, I did have the
focus on the problems of Western Michigan and the state of Michigan. But in the committee assignments that I had during that quarter of a century were the most broadening ones that any member of the Congress ever had. I served on the Committee on Appropriations. In the first place, that committee handled all of the problems of the government, domestic as well as foreign. And then I had the blessing of an experience of serving on the Foreign Aid Subcommittee, the CIA Subcommittee, and the Department of Defense Subcommittee. So when I came to the Vice Presidency, here I was with 25 years of the best experience in Congress, placed in a position where I might have some opportunities to make decisions. So I think education in the Congress was a blessing, and I think it's been very, very helpful.
Do you feel that you, at this point, have succeeded in making it the Ford White House instead of the Nixon White House, even if you have some holdover staff members?
We haven't done as well as we intend to, but I think the American people have to understand that almost literally I became president overnight. And to move from the executive office building as vice president into the White House under those circumstances was unique. And I'm not the kind of a person who likes to cut somebody off, cut their throat, so to speak, overnight. I think you've got to give some reasonable period of transition. We've just about achieved that in the White House staff. And from now on, I think you and the news media can hold me and my people accountable.
We're looking at some television pictures of President Ford with members of Congress. As we're looking at Richard Norton Smith, you mentioned the holdover staff members. Who were the key holdovers that made a difference, positive or negative, in his presidency?
Well, of course, probably the most prominent was Alexander Haig, who had been Richard Nixon's chief of staff and who I think briefly assumed that he would continue in that role. He did not continue in that role very long. He was sent to, I believe, to NATO in Europe. And Don Rumsfeld was brought in, a young congressman who had served with Jerry Ford, someone whose trust and friendship he had earned over the years. And he brought with him an even younger staff assistant by the name of Dick Cheney.
Time for your telephone calls. Phone lines are open for your questions for now until the top of the hour. We divide them by party affiliation, as we do with these modern presidents, because this is, for many of us, our political roots, and have your phone calls about the Ford presidency come in this way. For Democrats, 202-737-0001. For Republicans, 202-737-0002. And for Independents, 202-628-0205. Let's go back out to the Ford Library. Elaine Didier is with us, and you've got that Camp David jacket that we just saw President Ford walking around Camp David with in the Harry Reasoner interview.
Absolutely. I'm standing next to the jacket that you saw in the video at Camp David. That was a wonderful tour. President Ford was a little different from some prior presidents in his use of Camp David. He really tried to use it as a personal retreat to spend time with his family, also reading, doing sporting activities, and using it as a change of pace from his life in Washington. In looking at the records, there were only 3 out of his 18 trips there where there were meetings with various people. So he really used it for personal time. Of course, you know, he's a golfer. There's a 3-hole course there that he would use. He played tennis, he swam, he shot some skeet, and again, just enjoyed time with his family when he was there.
In the introduction to that, we were talking about First Lady Betty Ford's her own cancer operation at the time, but I wanted to ask you about the First Lady, the former First Lady right now. She was back in the national spotlight as she stood with her family during the President's funeral ceremonies at the beginning of this year. Can you tell our audience how she's doing? I understand she's about to celebrate her 90th birthday in the spring.
Yes, her 90th will be next April, and we're beginning to plan some activities appropriate to that, probably for the museum in Grand Rapids. She's doing well. She became ill after the funeral, and it's taken a while to recover, but she's gaining strength, we hear every week, and is getting out more with friends and so on. So she's a very strong lady, and we have the greatest admiration for her.
For our two guests, it's time for your questions about the Ford presidency. Let's begin with a call from San Diego.
Hi, good evening. I'm just thoroughly enjoying the series. I have a question for Mr. Smith. I've been a great admirer of President Ford for a long, long while. I was 14 when he came into the White House. I feel he really to this day still has the respect and integrity of the American people. I was wondering, in the climate that Washington now is in with the polarization, do you think anyone with President Ford's qualities would be able to break through the loggerhead? And I also have just one quick question. I missed the show on FDR. Are you going to repeat these? I'm dying to know.
You want to take his question and I'll answer the...
Okay, sure. You know, it's a great question. The irony is, if you looked at the qualities to which you allude, they probably would be at least at or near the top of a list of what most voters of both parties say they want in a president. And I think one of the great revealing moments when President Ford died, there was a sense that the country really came together. And I think there was a feeling, it was not only about Gerald Ford, but I think people wanted to feel good again about the political process and about their leaders and about Washington, and that partisanship, in fact, could be adjourned. So it was a very revealing moment, and I think it generated a response that he, of all people, would have really appreciated.
And for watching it again, first of all, on the internet, every one of these programs is digitized as soon as we are finished with our live production, and it is archived on our website, cspan.org/presidential libraries, along with more than 1,000 hours of video, and much of it seen for the very first time, gathered from all 12 presidential libraries. So if you're interested in presidential history, there is just more than you can spend the next several years with on that website, cspan.org, presidential libraries. Let me ask Alain Didier on that comment the caller made about how divided the country is now politically. Your holdings demonstrate really what a contentious time it was politically in the United States then. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Our holdings reflect everything that was happening at that time, and yes, our holdings, and you'll see some things in the next segment, show that there were strong feelings on various issues, and people were not reticent about sending letters to President Ford or Mrs. Ford on those matters.
Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, next question.
Yes, hello. First, I'd like to thank you for this series. I think it's great, and I visited the Ford Museum this past summer and really enjoyed it. I have a question for Mr. Smith. As I recall, I was a mid-teen, let's say, in the mid-'70s when President Ford came into office. I remember him as being very conservative. I'm not being critical. I'm just trying to make an observation. And I don't remember it being mentioned during funeral activities late last year. But I do remember that President Ford vetoed a lot of bills as being too costly, and in many ways I remember him as being more conservative than President Reagan. Am I accurate in that memory?
Well, you know, that's a fascinating comment. He was from West Michigan, and they're wonderful people, salt of the earth, but they're Dutch and they're frugal. I think that's putting it mildly. And he was a real budget hawk. And in fact, you're absolutely right. He vetoed 66 bills, almost all of them because he thought they were too costly. And remember, the Democrats had swept Congress in the 1974 elections. So he had very few weapons. He really was reduced to the veto, but he used it. He used it frequently. And in that sense, arguably, he is, if not the last president, one of the few presidents in modern times who was really willing to go to the mat in an effort to hold down federal spending.
Well, the nation had just fought the Vietnam War. What was the deficit situation like?
Oh, gosh. You had annual budgets around $100 billion, a little over $100 billion. And when he took office, remember, we had stagflation, brand new, never before experienced combination of inflation and unemployment. And they were looking at anything from a 10 to a 15 to a 20 to a 25. I mean, they were looking at, relatively speaking, horrendous budget deficits. And of course, there was kind of a carryover from the New Deal. When you ran unemployment, basically the solution was for government to spend, and you didn't worry about deficits in time of unemployment. But what about if you have rampant inflation? The month before he became president, The month of July, the inflation rate was 3.7%.
And the Whip Inflation Now campaign?
Oh, the Whip Inflation Now campaign was, he talked about, it's a Harry Reasoner about growing into the office. He would say that he was a much better president 2 years later than he was in 3 months. Whip Inflation Now, I think, reflected a lot of things, including inexperience. It was a campaign, actually, to enlist the American people in a voluntary war on inflation. And in fact, if you go out to the library, there are thousands and thousands of letters from people who were willing to sign up, but it became a bit of a laughing stock in retrospect.
Let's take our next question from Union Grove, Alabama.
Yes, this is more of a comment than a question, but I appreciate you taking my call. It seems today that more of the Republicans of today are really ascribing to be more like Ronald Reagan, while Ronald Reagan, in my opinion, was not so much the great man that Gerald Ford was, and I really have a soft place in my heart for Gerald Ford, even though he was appointed and not actually elected. Just more or less that a thing I'd like to say. They really try to be today's Republicans more like Ronald Reagan, which seems to have gotten more popular lately than he ever was before. That's my comment.
Well, thank you, caller. In our second hour, as we get closer to the president's election bid, we'll be setting up the great contest in the Republican Party between Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford. What was going on inside the Republican Party during the Ford presidency?
Well, the great irony is at the time, he was regarded as the most conservative president since Calvin Coolidge.
Gerald Ford was.
Gerald Ford was. The fact is that conservatism was about to be redefined by Ronald Reagan.
Bainbridge Island, Washington. Good evening. You're on the air.
Thank you very much. I had the pleasure of meeting President Ford and his son Steve at a convention, and I found Steve to be a particularly articulate advocate of his father. I'm curious now what role Mrs. Ford and the Ford children play in the running and the management of the museum and of the library.
Dr. Didier?
Thank you. The family are members of the Gerald Ford Foundation and are active in that regard. The current chair of the foundation is son Jack Ford, and all 3 of the other children are members, as is Susan's husband, Vaden Bales. We are a federal facility, so that in terms of management of the library and the archives here in Ann Arbor, we report to the Archivist of the United States, and we're a part of the presidential library system that is a part of the National Archives and Records Administration. So presidential families can play a very major role both in being gracious, as the Fords have been incredibly gracious, in sharing personal mementos and adding to our collection, which helps us with exhibits and with research material. They can provide leadership for the foundation, and we're glad to have suggestions for programming and so on. One of the realities is that families have lives, have working environments, have children, have their own responsibilities. So more often than not, we can invite, we'd love to have the family at all of our events, and that's just not a realistic nor a fair expectation. So I think we have to be thoughtful and sensitive to what we expect of presidential families.
You mentioned earlier that the Ford family itself has been sending you more artifacts and documents. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's been coming in this year?
Absolutely. I can share with you a treasure that just came into us within the last couple of months. We received more than 100 boxes on pallets from the Ford office and from the family, and we found a treasure, and I'd like to show you that treasure. This is the box, the way it came. This was in an envelope of personal papers with Ford's initials, and what we have here is a photograph of his pilot's license that he earned. This was his student pilot's license from November of 1942. He had enlisted and then served for 4 years in the Navy during the war, and this shows his qualification to fly, and then we also have a logbook that shows his individual flights, first with an instructor, and then after that his solo flights.
Next question is from Worcester, Massachusetts.
Hello. I have 2 points I'd like comment on. Not being alive during the presidency of Mr. Ford, I'm curious to know what the central theme of his re-election campaign was. And then secondly, more to the point of him personally, how bad did he really want to get re-elected president? How committed was he to seeking 4 more years? Thank you very much.
Two interesting questions.
Yeah, very interesting. I hate to sort of distill all that, but I think it's safe to say that the overriding theme of the re-election campaign was that this was a man who had brought the country together, who had restored trust in the government.
And how much did he want it?
He wanted it badly. He decided very early on. He had never wanted to be president, but once he became president, he decided he would very much like to remain as president. And of course, he wanted a chance to win a term in his own right and be president in his own right.
Much of this footage is shot by Navy photographers. Can you talk about that process?
Oh yeah, that goes back, back to the, I think to the Roosevelt and Truman era. The Signal Corps follows presidents around, and it's an incredible, invaluable historical tool because they are behind the scenes where none of the media go. They literally, almost like the Secret Service, they blanket a president's movements, and you get this wonderful, intimate footage.
Our colleague Eric Nelson has spent the past year at the 12 presidential libraries combing through their resources along with the staff to find bits of audio and video like the video you're seeing right now to present for this series. I want to talk about the family for a minute. We saw just a few seconds back some photographs, some video of the Ford children. The president in the Camp David interview made it sound like it was just not a difficult transition from Alexandria to the White House.
Yeah, it was a little more difficult, I think, than that. First of all, this happened literally overnight. Steve Ford had said we barely had time to comb our hair. And all of a sudden, there they are. They're thrust into the biggest spotlight in America. Susan didn't want to go to the White House because she said it would mean giving up her blue jeans. Mrs. Ford said, all right, if I have to go, I'll go, but I'm too old to change. And in fact, one of the things that didn't change that caused, believe it or not, controversy was the Fords slept in the same bed as they had since 1948. And there were some concerned Americans who actually wrote the White House to protest that fact.
We have another one of the clips of the one-on-one interviews that photographer David Hume Kennerly did with President Ford in the mid-1990s. And this one is a story about Queen Elizabeth. Can you tell us a little bit about?
That's right. It's the bicentennial celebration. The Fords are the hosts, America's hosts, to a number of state visitors, topped off by the Queen and Prince Philip, who turn out to have had a unusually memorable visit.
This is a fun story. Let's listen.
There's another picture. You don't see her laughing that hard anymore, right?
Well,
that was at
Her
the state dinner.
Majesty was our guest for our bicentennial celebration in the nation's capital. We had a most enjoyable evening. Two incidents. It was a white tie affair. We invited our children, including our son Jack. As you know, when you have a state dinner, the President and the First Lady go down and greet the main guest, and you take them to the elevator, and you take the elevator to the second floor, where you sit for 10 or 15 minutes in conversation. Well, we met the Queen and her husband, took them to the elevator. We got on the elevator, went to the second floor, the door opens, and there's our son Jack standing without a shirt on, waiting to go up to the third floor. And Mrs. Ford and I apologized to the Queen and the Prince, and she smiles and said, "Don't worry, we have one just like it."
And here is some television footage of the Ford family greeting Queen Elizabeth for the American bicentennial.
The other thing that the President was referring to, when they took to the dance floor, the Marine Band broke into a lusty rendition of The Lady is a Tramp.
Some fun stories. We are just about finished at the top of our first hour here. I want to go back out to the Ford Library and Elaine Didier. You know, we haven't had much chance in this hour, which is focusing on the early days of the Ford presidency, to talk about foreign policy. But I want to use an artifact that you have there, the baby shoes, if you don't mind, to talk about the fall of Saigon.
Absolutely. We have incredible papers from the fall of Saigon. You're going to be seeing some of those in the next segment. Those are materials that I find incredibly powerful, partly because of the age I was at that time. But also, just before the fall of Saigon, there was what was called Operation Baby Lift. President Ford authorized funds to airlift 2,000 Vietnamese orphans from Saigon orphanages to bring them to be adopted by parents here in the United States. It was a massive humanitarian effort. There were military and commercial airplanes involved. There were numerous volunteers, civilian coordinators, and these are a donation that has come in since President Ford passed away from a civilian volunteer who had these mementos. These are baby shoes from some of those children who came here sometimes in ill health and then were adopted into American homes. We also have quilts, we have other clothing and other items, but it's a wonderful illustration and it's a very poignant story and a real tribute to President Ford's leadership that he said something to the effect of, everyone suffers in a war, but children suffer the most, and we must do whatever we can to assist. And the museum was honored in May of this year to host a tribute event. People who were involved in that airlift effort, and as well as adoptees and some of the adoptive parents, came to the museum in Grand Rapids, and we had a wonderful event and had Steve Ford with us, as a matter of fact. And it was wonderful to hear their story. So for us, it's a very happy ending at the end of what was a very difficult time in Vietnam.
Elaine Didier is the director of the Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum, and she and her staff hope you will come visit her. We're going to say goodbye to Dr. Didier for our first hour, but we have another full hour to go as we discuss the presidency of Gerald R. Ford using the artifacts from the Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum. We'll be right back.
You're watching C-SPAN's Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, a unique look at 12 of America's modern presidents, using rarely seen film and video, revealing a new perspective of these men. Tonight's program will continue in a moment, and you can watch this program in its entirety later here on C-SPAN at 11 p.m. Eastern, and hear more about tonight's president with additional audio recordings and interviews with noted historians. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio, XM Satellite Radio Channel 132. And for more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries.
Next Friday, C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries History Uncovered will be live from the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta, Georgia. We'll look at Carter's rise from outsider candidate to victor in the 1976 presidential election and examine some of the major foreign and domestic policy initiatives of his presidency, showing you portions of key speeches as well as footage shot by Navy film crews. The program will also include viewer call-in sections. That's live next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
Sunday, on C-SPAN's Q&A, filmmaker Charles Ferguson on his documentary No End in Sight, following the Bush administration's decision to go to war in Iraq.
I have come to believe that ideology alone does not completely explain, cannot completely explain the decisions that were made here.
Charles Ferguson, Sunday night at 8 on C-SPAN's Q&A.
And now we continue with the C-SPAN series Presidential Libraries History Uncovered from the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
What you're looking at right now is some archival film of Gerald R. Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. As we begin our second hour of examination of the Ford presidency, through the documents and video and other artifacts at the Ford Presidential Library. This series produced by our executive producer for history, Mark Farkas. Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian, is on the set with us now, and we're going to spend some time in this second hour on some very specific themes. First of all, his foreign policy as president. Also, the attempts on his life, we'll be talking about those later on, and then the run for his own election in his own right, which he hoped to do in 1976 but was unsuccessful. Let's start with foreign policy. What kind of marks would you give him?
Oh, gosh. I think historians view the foreign policy as a time of continuity in many ways. Arms control with the Soviet Union, he was not able to finalize a SALT deal, but they reached an informal understanding in terms of limits on offensive weapons, which, even though there wasn't a formal treaty, actually turned out to be in force. I mean, that was certainly a frustration. There was a lot of things he started that were actually finished in the Carter administration. The Panama Canal treaties, for example, is something that Kissinger was negotiating. The other big thing is, again, before there was Camp David, Ford and Kissinger had to negotiate a standback. After the Yom Kippur War, remember, the Egyptians and the Israelis were staring across the Suez Canal, and basically they negotiated a separation of the warring parties, and that began the process of cooling off the tensions, which, of course, then President Carter would very successfully tap into in the Camp David Accords. And in fact, he told the story at the funeral. I'll never forget. I didn't know it. He said, coming back from Camp David, they made one phone call. He called, with Sadat, I believe, he called Jerry Ford to tell him.
Cold War geopolitics were framed in the U.S. and the Soviet Union. What can you tell us about the relationships between the two nations during the Ford presidency?
Well, it's very interesting. It's a very complex period because on the one hand you have détente, this attempt to thaw the Cold War and to look for connections whenever you can. In fact, I think we're just going to see some footage that illustrates that with the, here's a curiosity. These are the Soviet cosmonauts. The Apollo-Soyuz joint mission occurred during the Ford presidency. It was probably the height, no pun intended, of détente. And the president greeted the cosmonauts at the White House, and he took them to the Alexandria Crab Fest, which he and his family had been attending for many years as residents of Alexandria. I don't think he got to eat very much. It looks like he's signing autographs. But in any event, so you had these attempts in terms of arms control and the like. At the same time, however, you also had there was no doubt that there was aggressive moves by the Soviets, particularly in Africa, for example, Cuban mercenaries in Angola. So you had this curious kind of transitional period where, on the one hand, you were looking for opportunities to cool tensions without, quite frankly, stepping back from the brink and being willing to shoulder responsibilities when there were tensions.
One of the major components of this program tonight is a series of clips from interviews done by photographer David Hume Kennerly. He had clearance and was a major photographer of the Ford presidency. In 1995, he sat down with the former president for one-on-one interviews for many of the historic events that he witnessed with his camera. Next, we're going to show a portion of that dealing with meeting with the Soviets at Vladivostok. Set the stage for it.
That's right. This is just 3 months into the Ford presidency. I believe the summit had actually been scheduled while Richard Nixon was still in the White House. Ford went ahead with it. He flies all the way to Vladivostok, which is as far from Washington as you can get, for a very picturesque, I think you could say, and eye-opening meeting with his Soviet counterpart, Leonid Brezhnev.
Let's listen.
We were in Vladivostok to negotiate with Brezhnev. The meetings were actually held at a Soviet Navy rehab center, which had been closed. But in order to have the negotiations, the Soviets opened it up and rehabilitated it. Well, we, Secretary Kissinger and myself and others, had one building. The Soviet officials had another. One interesting story, the Soviets had learned that I liked to swim. Well, they had this swimming pool that had been closed, Olympic size. So in preparation for my coming to the negotiations, they reopened the pool, painted it, put the water in, and my Army aide, Bob Barrett, said, "Mr. President, you have to go swim there." Well, despite the cold weather and a few other obligations, I went over and had a swim, but only to please my Soviet friends who had gone to a great deal of trouble to make the pool usable. Actually, we negotiated for about 2.5 days. The first day we went on to, what, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning?
Well, yeah, and let me interrupt you just to show you this photograph, and there was actually these two. This was outside at like midnight. It was 40 below zero. Tell me why you were outside talking.
This photo shows that wolf coat that I had that Mr. Brezhnev admired as we landed at the airport. It was a beautiful wolf skin coat that a friend of mine had given me in Anchorage, where we landed on the way to Vladivostok. This photograph is one of Secretary Kissinger and probably General Scowcroft and several others meeting with me outside our dwelling. We had to meet outside because we knew that the Soviets had bugged the place where we were staying. So if Kissinger and me with Scowcroft and others had a conference in that residence, the Soviets could have listened and known what we were talking about. So we had to go outside about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to hold a conference, and that photograph is evidence that that's where we had our meeting.
Can I assume that this conference was a little shorter than it might have been inside?
We didn't linger.
It was President Ford in 1995 with photographer David Hume Kennerly, and there on your screen is a wolf skin coat, much like the one that was given to Brezhnev. And let me introduce you to our guest for our second hour, David Horrocks, who is supervisory archivist at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library. Mr. Horrocks, how did that coat end up in your collection if the President gave it away?
Well, when he returned back to the United States, his friend and the maker of the coat gave him a replacement one. But he didn't take this one out of the country. He kept it.
You have a very long association with Gerald R. Ford history. Will you tell our audience about it?
Oh, I was working for the National Archives back in 1975-76. And after the Ford-Carter election, I worked on gathering up the Ford materials, worked with many other people, and have really seen this library take shape from when it was in a warehouse and the foundation was being laid.
And yet getting lots and lots of new material this year. We're going to learn more about that as we talk to you during the second hour. Now, as we talk about that summit with the Soviets, you've got an artifact there that people will find very interesting.
Oh, we do. Ford met Leonid Brezhnev again. This was in Helsinki in 1975. And this item here was scooped up out of Leonid Brezhnev's ashtray by a member of the American delegation. And it's in Russian, it's notes. They've scotch-taped the scraps together. And the Americans recreated, translated it into this dialogue here of Brezhnev saying, really, we hope, Mr. Ford, that you win the upcoming American election. President Ford says, well, thank you. I think we will. We intend to. We're doing a good job. And then Brezhnev goes on to say, basically, why you say in private you want to, he really wants to know why he hears different things.
There's a lot of intrigue about why scraps would be found in an ashtray at a summit.
Well, in fact, yeah, there's a conspiracy theory that in fact it was a plant. The Soviets actually are part of a plot actually to have Brezhnev, tear this thing up and ostentatiously leave it in an ashtray where it would be found and reconstructed by the spooks of the CIA or someone.
But fairly innocuous message. We hope you'll be reelected.
Yeah, if it was a conspiracy, it wasn't worth hatching.
Now, a name that was mentioned by the President in that's Brent Scowcroft.
Yeah, Brent Scowcroft began his very long and distinguished career. I think he was in the Nixon White House, but he was Henry Kissinger's chief deputy in the Ford White House. And then, of course, remember, Gerald Ford split Henry Kissinger's job. Under Richard Nixon, Kissinger was both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. It wasn't that Ford had any lack of confidence in Kissinger. He had great confidence in Kissinger, but he believed, remember, he came out of Congress, and he believed that it was important, the original act setting up the National Security Council, that it was a kind of counterweight. Not an automatic foe by any means of the State Department, but one more independent voice that a president would hear in making foreign policy, and he had enormous confidence in Brent Scowcroft.
Moving to the other foreign policy date we talked about, that was the April 75 fall of Saigon. The significance of this for the American public?
Well, it was absolutely traumatic. And yet the amazing thing is, if you look back, as traumatic as it was at the time, how quickly we recovered. It was, in some ways, it's a real testimony to the resiliency of the American people. But of course, what happens, and here, you'll hear it from President Ford's own lips, but basically he describes the events during those tumultuous last days in April of 1975, when it's clear that Saigon will fall, and he is confronted with a decision that, needless to say, no American president would ever want to make again.
And let's hear President Ford reflecting upon that in 1995.
The situation was deteriorating so that by the winter of 1975, something had to be done in order to strengthen the South Vietnamese in their opposition to the North. I thought the best way to get the facts out would be to send General Fred Wyan, who was head of the Army, to South Vietnam to come back and give me an on-the-spot appraisal of what had to be done, if anything, to save the situation. I took the Wyan report, recommended that the Congress appropriate the necessary funds militarily and economically to try and salvage a desperate situation. The Congress lost its guts. They said no military aid and very limited economic aid, and the net result was the South Vietnamese forces didn't have adequate ammunition, didn't have adequate other support. So we were faced with a tragic withdrawal of all U.S. forces and as many of our South Vietnamese friends as possible. I decided that we would stay to the very end to make sure that we got all Americans and as many of our South Vietnamese supporters as possible. And that led to a very dramatic exit from the American embassy.
In fact,
with many of our friends from the South Vietnamese and our own people going by helicopter literally from the roof of the American embassy.
And this was the night, this is in the residence of the White House, where you ordered Frequent Wind, which was that last helicopter pickup. That was the finale, which started and then went through to the next afternoon. Well, and these are pictures, these are the photos from that night.
To sit in the White House, either in the private quarters or in the Oval Office, and know that we, the United States, are being whipped, defeated, was not a pleasant experience for the President, Commander-in-Chief. Here's a photograph of me having gotten the word from Saigon that it was hopeless. The South Vietnamese forces were inadequate to protect us, and our only choice was to get all American personnel, military and civilian, and as many of our South Vietnamese friends as possible out. And we were literally surrounded. Our forces were surrounded at the embassy. It was a hectic, tragic 24 hours. Our military did a fabulous job with their helicopter flights under very difficult circumstances. But to sit there in the White House and to see that transpiring was probably as low a point during my administration as any.
And in fact, actually, there's a little more to the story, because in addition to General Wyan, President Ford sent David Kennerly, his photographer, to Southeast Asia, because he knew Kennerly, who was an iconoclastic kind of guy, and he would give him the truth. He would give him a report with the bark off, as he said. And that's exactly what he did. He came back, he said, Cambodia's lost, and anyone who tells you that South Vietnam can survive is bullshitting you. Pardon my language, that's David Kennelly. And Ford took that very seriously. They put photographs that Kennelly took throughout the West Wing of the White House. And there were members of the staff who were actually upset by the images, and Ford said, keep them up. People need to know what's going on over there.
Now, before we leave that moment, can we replay that little bit of video again? Because there's a person in there I want you to talk about. It was in the Oval Office, and we saw a member of the President's Cabinet.
Okay.
Can we see it again? I don't know if we can do that quickly, but it was the first African-American in the cabinet.
Oh, yeah, Bill Coleman, sure. Bill Coleman, very distinguished lawyer who is, in fact, the first African-American cabinet officer to serve a Republican president. He was Secretary of Transportation. And remember, one of the Ford administration's initiatives was deregulation. They wanted to deregulate. They got the railroads deregulated, and they started airline deregulation. And Bill Coleman was the president's point man on what was a very difficult assignment.
And we're not going to get to him in time. I hope people can recall the image from back. I'm sorry to do that to our folks in the control room. Well, let's get back to the fall of Saigon. We're going to go back out to the Gerald R. Ford Library and David Horrocks, who has an artifact from that time period to help add some additional context. What do you have for us?
Oh, yes. Well, as you can imagine, we have lots of material from the White House during the fall of Saigon, from the White House Situation Room and the National Security Council. But we also have one of the last documents created in the Saigon embassy itself. This is a cable from Ambassador Martin in the embassy to the commander of the 7th Fleet saying, hurry up, get more of these helicopter sequences running. We have a lot of people here. We need to get them out in a hurry. And at the very bottom, his last sentence is, I hate like hell to think of spending another night here.
That document is available.
This was
is available on C-SPAN's website, cspan.org/presidential libraries. I'm sorry, you had more to say about it?
Oh, I was just going to say this was a gift to us from the number 2 person at the embassy, Wolfgang Lehmann, who donated a collection of material to us. And people who have served in government and donate material do a wonderful thing, and we rely on them to build the historical record.
During his brief presidency, Gerald R. Ford was the subject of 2 assassination attempts, both by women. Can you help us understand how this could have happened?
Well, it's hard to get inside the mind of an assassin, particularly if that mind belongs to Squeaky Fromm, a member of the Manson gang. But in any event, twice, both times in California, in September of 1975, when the president was visiting there, he was, in fact, the target of would-be assassins. And he describes that in this clip from the David Kennelly interviews.
I mean, just tell me what is happening. You're walking. This has got to be something you remember quite clearly, right? I would think.
I was in Sacramento to speak to a group of California businessmen. I was at the hotel across from the Capitol. I then decided after the speech to walk over to the Capitol to pay a courtesy call to Governor Jerry Brown. So from the hotel to the Capitol, I had to walk across a green park area. And as I was walking, I was shaking hands with people 2, 3, and 4 deep. And as I was doing the handshaking, I noticed in the background a woman in a red dress. It was so red it was very prominent. And as we got closer and closer to the Capitol, all of a sudden I went to shake a hand, and here was a hand with a pistol in it. And I was probably 2 feet away. And Larry Boondorf, who was my Secret Service agent right behind me, saw it and grabbed the hand and the pistol before Squeaky Fromm could pull the trigger. And of course the agents then threw me back and seized her, but it was a pretty close call. Well, I walked in following the incident to say hello and to have some chit-chat with Governor Brown. I didn't think it was appropriate for me to say, on the way to see you, Governor, a lady tried to shoot me. I was shocked that somebody like Squeaky Fromm would have such a strong feeling that she wanted to assassinate me. That was something that was hard to comprehend, but once it didn't happen, there was no point in, worrying about it. It was something that didn't transpire. So the interesting thing is that after she went to prison, she wrote me a letter saying, in effect, that she would do it again if she had the chance. She also said this was a private letter. It should not be published, which I have not done. But the interesting thing is that when I had a lot of papers and documents looked at by an appraiser, that letter from her was the most valuable among many.
More valuable than a letter from Brezhnev or Saddam?
Well, according to Sotheby's, that's true.
And Squeaky Fromm is still in prison today?
She is still in prison today. And then, of course, the second attempt came 2 weeks later in San Francisco. The president comes out of, I believe it was the St. Francis, Union Park, and waved to a crowd, and all of a sudden, once again, the crack of gunfire. This time a bystander had seen Sarah Jane Moore, who was a middle-aged woman with ties to Bay Area radical groups. And he deflected he pushed her arm, and that deflected the bullet. It missed the president. He was pushed into the car. The agents fell on top of him. He said, "Guys, you're kind of heavy." And they got off of him. They went out to the airport. Mrs. Ford came. She knew nothing about this. She was walking down the aisle of Air Force One. Cheerfully says, "Well, how did San Francisco treat you?" And they had to tell her that someone had tried to shoot him.
And we go back out to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library. Dave Horrocks, you have on hand a collection of materials from Sarah Jane Moore. How did you come to have those?
Well, Sarah Jane Moore, after she went to prison, carried on quite a correspondence with a San Francisco area social activist. And a few years ago, that woman's daughter donated these letters to the library. You can see right now it's an unprocessed collection. Papers are very yellow. Prison paper is not what it could be. But this is really quite a collection of a woman who's trying to continue the revolution from behind bars. And I'm not familiar with the Squeaky Fromm letter, but we do have this item here, which is a copy of a letter that Sarah Jane Moore wrote to President Ford in January of '75. And it's a very peculiar letter. She says, essentially, "I didn't really mean to attack you personally. I meant to attack the office. It really wasn't anything personal," and I'm paraphrasing. And then she concludes at the end by saying, "Excuse my use of this pencil and stationery, but that's the best we have in prison."
From the Sarah Jane Moore Presidential Assassin collection at the Gerald R. Ford Library. We have about a half an hour left to go in our 2-hour discussion about the Gerald R. Ford presidency, our 38th president, and we will begin taking telephone calls in just a little bit. While we're talking about assassinations, earlier in his career, President Ford had an important role in the investigation of another assassination.
He did, and it was very personal with him because he used to talk about the friendship he had with a young congressman named Jack Kennedy. They had offices opposite each other in the House Office Building, and they used to go over on the floor and vote together. They usually would basically cancel each other's vote out, except on foreign policy.
Did they both arrive in Congress at the same time?
Actually, a couple years. I think Jack Kennedy was elected in '46, and Jerry Ford came 2 years later. But whatever they disagreed about domestic policy, they were internationalists. They were both veterans of the war, and they believed very strongly that the United States had Cold War responsibilities. So they became actually very good friends, and so he was particularly shocked by the assassination of President Kennedy in November of 1963. Well, within 48 hours, Ford takes a call. Now remember, Ford is not yet minority leader in the House. He takes a call from the new president who wants him to be on the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination. And they used to talk about the Lyndon Johnson cocktail. What was it? A bourbon, water and a twist of the arm. And in this case, he didn't have to twist Jerry Ford's arm too hard. But he became a member of the Warren Commission, and one of the more bizarre moments in the history of that organization came when he and Chief Justice Earl Warren flew to Dallas and interviewed Jack Ruby in his jail cell.
This is an oral history done with President Ford, and it's not part of the Ford collection. It's actually part of the JFK Library collection, and he's discussing his thoughts on Oswald's motives for the JFK assassination.
Did you actually talk to any of these people? Did you actually, or were you present?
Oh, I was present and interrogated all of the lead witnesses, Marina and the mother and so forth.
Right. Now, what was your impression of Marina, for example?
Well, the mother was kooky.
Really?
You could understand why the son was odd. The wife, who was a Russian, he married her in the Soviet Union, was surprisingly able. I have the feeling, and I think others shared it, that he Oswald, assassinated Kennedy because he was being prodded by his wife about his impotence and so forth, that he had to do something to display his bravado. Now, that's a theory.
That's interesting. Did you think that she was prodding him specifically toward that kind of act, or that was just his way of...
That was his action. I don't think she suggested that particular action.
The voice of the interviewer on that was a woman by the name of Vicki Dates. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? He said that, in fact, this was a theory. It never appeared in print, never appeared in the Warren Commission report, but apparently it was discussed by several members of the Commission. He was the last surviving member of the Commission, and in his later years he used to get asked all the time about the Oliver Stone movie, JFK, which I think he was once actually forced to sit through on an airplane. He didn't think much about his history.
Back out at the library, David Horrocks, you, I understand, have some artifacts to show our audience about President Ford's own notes upon meeting with Jack Ruby, who was Oswald's assassin.
Yes, in 1964, several members of the Warren Commission went down to Dallas, and they interviewed Jack Ruby at length in a very, very tense, I guess, and uncertain kind of interview. Ruby was very testy. They also went to the Texas School Book Depository with a stopwatch and retraced Oswald's steps and tried to time it. And this is Ford's report that he composed after he got back of that experience and of the room in which Ruby was interviewed. This is just one small part of our extensive holdings on President Ford's service on the Warren Commission. We have drafts of parts of the report and extensive depositions, declassified, and much else.
Time for us to involve you once again with your questions. Democrats 202-737-0001, Republicans 202-737-0002, and our line for independents 202-628-0205. And we'll take your telephone calls for this last half hour here as we talk about the presidency of Gerald R. Ford and look at artifacts that are the part of the collection of the Gerald R. Ford Library. We're going to be moving into this part, into the 1976 election.
Well, you know, everything about the Ford presidency was unprecedented, including the fact that as an incumbent president, he would face a formidable challenge. In fact, arguably the most formidable challenge since Teddy Roosevelt ran against his former friend William Howard Taft way back in 1912. And this time, of course, the challenge would come from the right and from the former governor of California, Ronald Reagan.
First telephone call for this hour of the program is from Chicago. You're on the air, caller.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Smith. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Question, first of all, I read your book on Thomas Dewey. I loved it.
Thank you.
And when is your book on Nelson Rockefeller going to be done?
Well, I wish I could give you a definite answer. Probably 2 to 3 years, realistically. It is an enormous subject, as you can imagine.
We just saw a video of Gerald Ford and Tip O'Neill. What was their relationship
They
like?
were, they were great buddies. And it was at the time in Washington when basically you could beat up on each other. And at 6 o'clock you'd adjourn and be good friends. There was a young White House staffer who was rather naive in the ways of this city, who couldn't believe the difference between Tip O'Neill in the office, who was warm and jovial and bear-like. And then he went out on the north lawn of the White House in front of cameras and said terrible things about the president. And this young staffer came back and said, "You won't believe what Tip O'Neill just said about you. It's terrible." He described it. Ford was sitting at his desk with his pipe, never looked up at the paper, never removed the pipe. He just said, "Don, that's politics."
Lafayette, Indiana, you are on the air.
When I was a grad student at Purdue back in the early 80s, I studied Gerald Ford in a graduate class, political communications. And there wasn't a lot on presidential speeches, not a lot of books at that time. They're kind of proliferated the last 10 or 15 years. But Gerald Ford gave more presidential speeches than any president in American history. Gave almost 900 speeches his first year as president. He had to go around the rest of the country and talk about Watergate and inflation and Vietnam. And I was always amazed that people didn't consider him the great communicator, because every now and then C-SPAN will run an old Ford speech, especially in December after President Ford died. And I'm amazed at what kind of a communicator he really was. I mean, a lot of parody of him on Saturday Night Live and that sort of stuff, but he could really deliver a speech. And he's the kind of president, at least for me, I came of age in that period, that I have more respect for him as the years go by.
Dave Porx, would you like to comment on that for the caller?
Well, I think a lot of people, I think that's the common reaction, is that people have more respect as years go by and in perspective see what he brought to the country. One of the ironies of Ford's speeches is one of his finest speeches that he ever gave was his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention. But unfortunately, because of the convention struggle, it didn't get aired until very late in the evening, and most of the country missed it. It's a great irony, and it was one of his best speeches.
Next question is from Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Yeah, I was a member of Echo Company, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, May 15th, 1975, the rescue of the SS Mayaguez. We lost 41 men to take back 38, but during the time of his presidency, nobody ever talks about the Mayaguez incident. There's always either Phnom Penh or Saigon. Is it because it's considered a military failure, or is it just something that's a scab or a sore spot on his presidency?
Thank you. I'd actually like both of our guests to comment first about the importance in the history, and then, Dave Parks, would you talk about what you have in your collection that helps scholars understand the incident? Mr. Smith?
Well, the caller has a point in that it certainly loomed much larger at the time than it has over the years. I don't think that's anything deliberate. I think...
if people don't know what it was...
Yeah, sure. The Mayaguez was an American ship that was taken... the crew was taken off the ship by the Khmer Rouge, who had, these bloodthirsty types who had taken Cambodia before the fall of Saigon in South Vietnam. And the caller is absolutely right. There were something like 41 men who died. The crew was rescued. But there were deaths. I think helicopter crashes accounted for most of that. The reason why it was such a big deal at the time was it came less than a month, or about a month after the fall of Saigon. And in a kind of curious, inverted, almost Bay of Pigs way, the mere fact that we had, quote, won one, notwithstanding that significant loss of life, was seen as evidence that the United States wasn't permanently crippled by the humiliation of the previous month.
Dave Parks, what else can you tell our viewers about what you have in the collection?
Yeah, there's actually been a lot of research here at the library on the Mayaguez over the years. Some of it, of course, in our White House collections, but also in two surprising collections. One, Sea-Land Services, the commercial company that owned the Mayaguez ship, did extensive oral histories with its crew members after they were freed, and we have those oral histories. The U.S. Marine Corps also did a lot of interviewing with members of Marines who landed on Koh Tang Island, and those are here as well, among other materials. So it's really Actually, it's an exceptionally rich collection at the library, and it's been quite well used.
Colorado Springs, you're on the air.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for taking my call. My name is Brian. I wanted to start off by thanking Mr. Richard Norton Smith for his book on Herbert Hoover. It was one of the most insightful political biographies I'd ever read, insightful and wonderful prose, and I really enjoyed that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And my question is, it seemed to me that the choice of Richard Schweiker in '76 by then Governor Reagan showed, to me at least, that Governor Reagan could have worked with Gerald Ford. And in 1980, his famous question, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" reflected highly on Gerald Ford, since Nixon had the resignation and Carter had the so-called years of malaise. And I was wondering if President Reagan ever showed any personal admiration for Gerald Ford and his administration. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question to learn more about the '76 campaign. Talk about who Dick Schweiker was and what that selection
Dick
meant.
Schweiker was a liberal. There used to be liberal Republicans. A liberal Republican senator from Pennsylvania. And Ronald Reagan did something quite unprecedented. Before the convention, he announced his running mate. It was Dick Schweiker, who everyone assumed would be a Ford supporter. The idea was, with this choice, we could break open the Pennsylvania delegation. The race was that tight, that 20, 30 delegates either way. And they rolled the dice, and it didn't turn out to work.
We don't have campaigns that are fought, delegate selection that seem to be fought this vociferously anymore. Tell people what it was like and how the head count was going for how many delegates each man had.
Well, it was extraordinary. I mean, the race seesawed back and forth, and in fact, we were talking about the Queen Elizabeth visit. The truth is, it's a good thing Her Majesty didn't see the guest list, because it was bloated with uncommitted Republican delegates and their families. Gerald Ford invented the Rose Garden strategy, using the White House, using the powers of incumbency, and bringing. There was one woman who shall remain nameless, I believe a delegate from the Bronx or Brooklyn, and 1 week she was for Reagan, and 1 week she was for Ford, and every week she would change her mind. So they finally said, "Okay, what will it take to nail you down?" And she said, "I have to bring my whole family to the Oval Office," and she brought 21 people for a personal meeting with the president. And there, of course, is the classic footage after the nomination on the last night of the convention in Kansas City, where President Ford invited Governor Reagan to come down and speak to the convention. And in fact, Reagan was so effective in those remarks that in many ways it was the opening gun of his 1980 campaign.
Greensboro, North Carolina.
Yes, thank you for C-SPAN. Why did President Ford drop Nelson Rockefeller in the election in '76 and pick Bob Dole as his running mate?
I think that probably the best answer to that is he was spooked by the Reagan challenge. To be quite honest with you, there were people around him. I don't think he took the prospect of Reagan running seriously as early as he probably should have. I think he probably underestimated Governor Reagan's appeal, and then I think belatedly woke up to the fact that this was a very serious challenge. The fact is that there are a lot of Southern delegates, especially, who are not happy with the vice president. One thing they were not happy about was he had ruled. This sounds very arcane, but you're C-SPAN viewers, so you will appreciate this. From the chair as vice president in a debate, basically the effect of his ruling was to lower the number of votes you needed to invoke cloture, to end a filibuster, from 67 to 60. And that riled a lot of Southern conservatives, people led by Strom Thurmond, for example, John Tower of Texas. They went to the White House. They were unhappy with the vice president. And there's some real question, quite frankly, and as you may know, I'm working on a biography of Vice President Rockefeller, as to whether, had he kept Rockefeller on the ticket, he would have been nominated in Kansas City. It was that close.
David Harks, among President Ford's materials are some notes he took about his observations of Ronald Reagan as his political career continued to unfold.
Oh yeah, history is full of ironies, and archives are full of surprises. And this item here, to set the context, it's 1964. It's a week before the presidential election. Ronald Reagan has this person in California has made his political television debut with a speech on behalf of Goldwater. Ford has seen this on television. This is his handwritten draft of a telegram to the chair of the Goldwater Committee. Reaction to Ronald Reagan television show, excellent. strongly urge it or something comparable by him be repeated. This is vitally important. And that's Gerald Ford about Ronald Reagan in 1964.
Yeah, you know, I often heard President Ford say that if he could do anything over again, he would have, in his education, have spent much more time developing his communication skills. He had his disagreements with Ronald Reagan, but he had enormous admiration for Reagan's ability to deliver a speech and to rouse the public.
We're going to listen to more and watch more of President Ford talking about his presidency with David Hume Kennerly. This is his reflections on the 76 nomination.
Our staff, Dick Cheney on my side, had negotiated with the Reagan staff that whoever won the nomination at Kansas City, the winner would go to the headquarters of the loser. And I won, so I went to Reagan's hotel.
That was walking to the press conference. This, to me, is the behind-the-scenes, rather grim. I mean, that was not a happy occasion for anybody. I mean, for you, it was happy maybe because you won, but it was a hard, difficult battle. It cost Nelson Rockefeller his job.
Truthfully, I had not developed a long-standing personal relationship with Governor Reagan. We were political friends, but we had not become personal friends. So I was upset when he challenged me. I thought it was unwise for a Republican to challenge a sitting Republican president who wanted to be nominated and elected. So there was this lack of a long-standing friendship and a decision to challenge me, which I didn't like. So we had a pretty bitter contest, and it was head-to-head and knockdown, drag-out affair. So at that time, I was not anxious to have him on the ticket, to be honest with you. Maybe his being a part of the ticket might have made a difference. I don't know. I do know he could have helped more during the campaign in 3 or 4 pivotal states that we lost by a narrow margin. But that picture clearly shows that it was not one of the happiest moments during my period as president.
And you were walking, then the next picture, this is the picture taken in the press conference that you were going to, and this
well, it shows that politics can, under certain circumstances, show a different attitude. Here's the reality, and here's the political reality, trying to show Republican unity.
And as we look at President Ford campaigning in New Hampshire, your reaction to listening?
Well, you know, that's characteristically plain spoken. Viewers should know that in later years, and particularly after President Reagan's famous letter revealing his Alzheimer's disease, there was a really much closer relationship that developed. And President Ford, on at least a couple occasions, actually went to visit President Reagan in his office. And the first time they had a great conversation, and the second couple years later, I think it was really a wrenching experience for him.
Dave Horrocks, we heard the role that Dick Cheney played in the 76 election bid for President Ford. What do you have of Dick Cheney in your collection there?
Well, the one item we have out right now, it's a very poignant item, and it was it's written in Cheney's handwriting on a memo that would have gone to Ford if he had won the election. It's a planning paper for a second Ford term. Obviously, it never went forward, and on the very last day of the administration, literally hours before Jimmy Carter takes the oath of office, Richard Cheney is in his office, and he pens this note to archivists: never submitted to the president for obvious reasons. R. Cheney, 12077.
How rich overall is your Cheney collection?
Well, I think there's a lot there. We have, obviously, when he was named vice president, we were deluged with journalists and others coming to use it. And it has its strengths and weaknesses. I think there's a good bit of material on the political campaign. There is material on reorganization of the intelligence community, which was an issue very much of the period. And there's a variety of other materials there. And I think you can also look beyond what came out of Richard Cheney's filing cabinets here, but also we have the files of all the people to whom he sent memos. All of the received memos in their collections are here.
That Richard Norton Smith, that photograph that we just had on the screen, which maybe we can put back up again, of Don Rumsfeld, Chief of Staff, and Dick Cheney, 1975, became very visible again to people here in modern times as these two men gained prominence in the current administration.
That's true, but you know, they're only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you can measure presidential legacy all sorts of ways, but if you look at the Ford administration, it was an extraordinary incubator of talent. Alan Greenspan, Carla Hills, I mentioned Bill Coleman, Brent Scowcroft, of course Henry Kissinger continued on, Ed Levy, who is the Attorney General in modern times, against which all others are measured. His one Supreme Court nominee, John Paul Stevens, who actually was one of the last people to be put on the court, not because of his politics or ideology, but because he was brilliant and overwhelmingly qualified.
Crystal, Minnesota, on our discussion on Gerald Ford. You're on the air.
Yeah, my wife and I visited the Ford Museum back in about 7 or 8 years ago, and in the beginning they had a thing on General Pershing and what's the other guy that was under him? Anyway, I kind of felt there that my dad served under Patton when they had the Mexican skirmish back in 1914. So I found that very interesting, besides the museum. And I shook hands with him, with Ford, a couple times in '76, and I was head of my Senate delegation to the when we picked a candidate between Reagan and Ford, and had a private meeting with Betty Ford, a group of my people. So it's very interesting watching this.
Well, thank you so much, sir. Anything on the military part of his comment?
Well, I think he was referring, actually, the Ford Museum, like some libraries, does major temporary exhibits, changing exhibits that they produce. And I remember, I think I was there, that we did a big World War I show. I think that's what he's probably referring to.
David Horrocks, we talked in the first half about the passions of the American public following Watergate and Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. You've got some evidence of that passion right in front of you.
Oh boy, do we. Within weeks of the announcement of the pardon, some 270,000 Americans sat down at their kitchen tables and desks and wrote to the president to tell them what they thought of it. These are just two boxes that we have to show you right now. They're still in their original White House storage boxes as they were packed in 1974 and 1975. This is part of our processing backlog. Just to show you a little bit about the passions, we've picked two letters that are very concise. This fellow was in favor of the pardon.
And can you read it? We can't quite see it.
All right. Watergate, he's got a little poll chart here. Watergate pardons, yes. Amnesty, meaning amnesty for draft dodgers, no. And that's his comment. From the other box, you can see where this person is coming from.
He writes ex-President Ford.
Yes, the envelope is addressed to ex-President Ford. And the message is, ex-President Ford, do the country a favor and resign.
Next telephone call about Gerald Ford, Garden City, Long Island, New York.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm actually an adoptive mother of two of the babies from Operation Baby Lift that was mentioned in your last hour by Dr. Didier, and it was my tremendous honor to participate in that ceremony, tribute ceremony to President Ford in May at the Ford Museum. And just to let you know, the painting, the photo of the painting that's on the C-SPAN website right now is called Welcome Home by Vietnam veteran artist Bernie Duff. And that photo of that painting, which we presented to Steve Ford in honor of his father posthumously, is on the C-SPAN website. And that photo shows the painting is from a photo of President Ford greeting the first baby lift arrivals back in April of 1975. We also presented the Heather Constance Noon Memorial Award posthumously to President Ford for his initiation of Operation Baby Lift. So on behalf of the Baby Lift adoptive parents, again, we have the most tremendous gratitude to President Ford for bringing our children home to us and for what he did. And there is a Vietnam Baby Lift website as well. It's just vietnambabylift.org for people who would like to see a photo of the plaque that we presented to President Ford and more information about his tremendous humanitarian effort, which to me was really the greatest humanitarian effort of the 20th century. And again, my gratitude to President Ford and his family.
Caller, how old are your adoptive children now?
Oh, thank you. Well, our first daughter, adopted from Baby Lift, Heather Constance Noon, died just 3 weeks after her arrival, and that's why we have the Memorial Award. Our second daughter from Baby Lift is 32 years old today, and she is just thriving beautifully, and again, would not have done so without President Ford. And we subsequently adopted a son from Korea, and he's now 30, and I'm a grandma. He and his wife have 2 children, so we're very grateful to President Ford.
And how many active members of the association that you mentioned are there?
Well, if you come to my website, www.vietnambabylift.org, we have so many people that are on there and have written their personal stories, and we have a tribute to President Ford. And then some of the adoptees have formed groups as well, and that's all on my links page. And we're hoping to have a big reunion, 35th reunion in the year 2010, and again, pay tribute to President Ford. My understanding was that he had a meeting in the White House the day that the first very small Baby Lift private aircraft landed on April 2nd, and on April 3rd he had a meeting at the White House and then went to California, and that afternoon he declared Operation Baby Lift. And I can't imagine anyone else doing that with that great speed, and he saved the lives of 2,548 babies and children.
Thank you for your call.
Thank you so much.
And you know, that's part of a larger story, because as soon as Saigon fell, there was perhaps an understandable urge on the part of many people, particularly in the Congress, to just try to put this all behind us, almost pretend that it had never happened. It was such a humiliating experience. And Congress, in effect, revoked funds that had been set aside to resettle refugees. And Ford was outraged. He thought that was a betrayal of the American tradition. So he put together this crazy coalition with the American Jewish Congress and George Meany and a number of governors, and basically went around and he shamed the Congress into restoring those funds, and they brought about 130,000 of the war's most innocent victims, including Operation Baby Lift.
Our last call is from Orem, Utah. You're on the air.
Yes, I want to congratulate C-SPAN and all of you for these wonderful programs. 2 quick questions. Quick one back to the Warren Commission, to Professor Smith or someone there. Did President Ford ever mellow at all with the evidence of the House Select Committee, who basically came out and said there was a conspiracy? Lyndon Johnson, to AIDS, said that he thought that there was a conspiracy. Did he ever change his mind about that? And I understand that in the later years there was a sort of a rift between President Ford and Vice President Cheney. Thank you again for these wonderful programs.
Thanks for watching. Dave Horrocks, on the Warren Commission question, can you help that viewer?
To my knowledge, no, he never wavered at all in his view on the Warren Commission, and he stood by the Warren Commission's findings.
And on the Cheney question?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's fair to say that there was rift. In fact, Vice President Cheney was remarkably supportive through the years and remained very close to President Ford. There's been some reports in the press concerning President Ford's implied or stated criticism of the war in Iraq and how we got into the war in Iraq, but he certainly never directed that against Dick Cheney.
Dave Horrocks, you've spent your, it's fair to say, entire professional career helping to preserve the history of the 38th President of the United States. I'm going to ask you in these closing moments here to put that presidency in some historical perspective for our audience. What do you think its significance is among modern American presidents?
I think the immediate thing in terms of American history was certainly the restoration of trust, but also the restoration of the economy. If you look at the Washington Post the day he took office, the Post said that the #1 job that the president had was, it was not getting past Richard Nixon and Watergate, it was really curing inflation and dealing with the economy. So I think in that policy sense, it was an important administration. I think more importantly, though, and this is a legacy that can be turned to at any time, is one of civility and decency and candor in the White House, and one can always look to that as something to be emulated.
Thank you for adding to our knowledge of the President tonight with your own scholarship and with the artifacts you've shown us.
Thank you.
And Richard Norton-Smith, same question for you, the perspective question.
Well, I think it's funny. The popular view had been that it's sort of a coda to the Nixon presidency. It's a Nixon-Ford administration. And I think with the passage of time, we're seeing more and more that, in fact, it, at very least, is a turning of the page. Economic deregulation, for example, policies that we now take for granted, the Middle East peace that bore fruit under President Carter, a number of other foreign policy initiatives, the Helsinki Accords, which we now see as a real milestone on a road to the end of the Cold War. So it's a more important presidency, it's a more eventful presidency, and in some ways it's a more surprising presidency than just the man who, quote, healed the country after Watergate.
Delia Rios is our producer for the Gerald Ford program and is on location in Michigan tonight. As we close out here, we're going to have one last bit of the David Kennerly personal interviews with President Ford. This one is all surrounding a photograph of 5 presidents.
That's right, an extraordinary photo, historic photo, taken, I believe, at the dedication of the Reagan Library in 1991, the only time when 5 American presidents were on the same spot, and David invited the president to offer some comments about his colleagues in what Herbert Hoover called our exclusive trade union.
Of course, as we say goodbye to you tonight, we will be back next week with Jimmy Carter presidency after that momentous election of 1976 when Gerald Ford lost his bid to win the White House in his own right, and we'll continue our discussion of presidential history then. Let's listen into this final clip of President Ford reflecting on the other presidents.
This is at the Reagan Library. That's a historic picture of the only gathering up until Nixon's funeral, actually, of 5 presidents. Just go left to right and just give me a little thumbnail sketch of each of these people that you've known, worked with, lost to, beaten. I mean, what a group. These are all people that represent our history of the last, 30 years.
I campaigned for George Bush when he first ran for Congress in the 1960s. I worked with him when he was National Republican Chairman. I sent him to China as my representative to the mainland, brought him back and made him head of the CIA. I campaigned for him when he ran for president. I think he's had a fine public service record. President Reagan, he was a fine governor of the state of California. We had quite a campaign before the Republican convention in Kansas City. I never really knew him intimately like I did several others here, but he won 2 national elections overwhelmingly, defeating 2 Democrats, and we developed a personal friendship in greater depth after he left the White House than during the time while he was in the White House. Jimmy Carter, I never knew him until we campaigned against one another. He came out of nowhere in the Democratic Party to get their nomination. We had a head-to-head confrontation. I came close to winning. He did prevail. We've become better friends after he left the White House. He's come to my library and museum on several occasions. I've gone to his library in Atlanta. We never agreed on domestic policy, economics, but we did cooperate on foreign policy. Dick Nixon was my longest and best friend of this group. We became friends the first day that I was sworn in as a member of the House, because he was in his second term and came down and congratulated me after I took the oath of office, and our friendship grew over the next 20-some years. I think in foreign policy, he was probably the best American president during the post-World War II period. Unfortunately, he made several very serious errors that history will condemn him for, but from the point of view of foreign policy, he was outstanding, and his resignation was a tragedy in American history.
And here you are in this historic Mount Rushmore type photograph. I mean, how does that strike you after all these years?
I knew each one of those people intimately. Campaigned for and against each one of them. That is a unique experience for any politician in the history of this country.
Tell me about Bill Clinton. I know you've spent a little time with him. He was the other person not in this photograph.
I've gotten to know President Clinton. I've played golf with him 3 occasions. Mrs. Ford and I have had dinner with him and his wife on 3 or 4 occasions. He's a brilliant speaker. He is a good salesman. I have many reservations about his positive determination on policies and issues. On the other hand, I think Hillary, his wife...
The Library's History Uncovered. From the Gerald Ford Library's History Uncovered. From the Gerald Ford Presidential Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Exploring the life and career of our 38th president.
Well, was it a good evening? Well, I got to bed about 1:30 and got up about 5:45, so it was a short evening. What are your feelings this morning as you prepare for this eventful day? I think a feeling of sadness on the one hand and expectation to start to build on the other. It does strike me as a terribly heavy responsibility, which we're going to try and work on and do our very best. The President talked last night of the heavy responsibilities that were going to be on your shoulders today. Do you feel?
For more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries. And as part